Game loaded.
Hi, and welcome to the edition of Lessons Learned with your host, Rafael Pinheiro. That'll be me over here on the bottom. You can finally see my face, sort of. Most of it's behind the mic because I have to speak close to the mic. Also, I'm an ugly bastard, so, the best of two worlds. We're doing the Math Community Podcast number 6 with Gary Dio and Sam. Say hi, guys.
Hello.
And we're doing the first video version of the podcast. Hopefully this will be a regular feature for a lot of reasons, but mostly because I'm lazy and I just want to do it this way. So there you go. And we're going to be continue the issue that we were talking about last time, simulation versus emulation. I want to do this topic this way. I'll say that simulation is something that a lot of people talk about or used to talk about a lot in RPGs. But the fact of the matter is that the moment they introduced like dragons and magic to wargaming, it wasn't really much of a simulation anymore. So the real issue is, I guess, emulating a world, a feel, a genre, etc. And how do you do that? I mean, how do you make a game that really sort of captures the essence of what you're trying to copy? Novels, movies, television, or anything you want to come up with in your own mind. I mean, that's the thing. So let's start with that.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because I was actually just this morning having a similar conversation about video game design in Stephen Lumpkin's chat. And one thing that really stuck with me that we were talking about is this idea that instead of going for realism or simulation, it's all about internal consistency, right? So is we want the mechanics to feel like they make sense even when they're not realistic. And I think that's often much more important. I don't want realistic combat. I want to be able to wade through a group of enemies and feel like a total badass. But I still want internally consistent mechanics to do that.
Yeah, and that's something where, like, a lot of narrative games, they offload the responsibility for consistency onto the narrative layer where it's done on, like, by the group as a whole rather than managed by the system itself. Sort of offloads that responsibility in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a problem that a lot of those type of story games have, is that it puts a lot of that work on the narrative layer, and thus it puts a lot of that work on the players. Like, for example, a game like Microscope. I've always had a blast playing Microscope, but that's because I've always played with great groups. If the group you're with is not getting along, is not playing together in a fun way, in a good way, and thinking about the world in the same way and building off each other's ideas, it's not going to work. And no amount of rewriting the mechanics is going to make it work. Whereas, I can sit down with a group of people and throw a bunch of dice and play a D&D module and have it be roughly the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing is that there's a burden of entering new narrative games that doesn't really exist in the same way in the simulationist games, because there's a lot of, like, unstated skill sets in terms of, like, learning to describe things in this way that, like, everyone is able to get, like, a consistent picture of what's going on and able to, like, get this consistent worldview. And these are like skill sets while GMing or like playing more narrative games that you develop eventually over time, but the games themselves definitely don't teach you how to do most of the time.
Some do more than others, for sure.
Yeah.
But the thing is, so the trade-off there is that the simulation game has the same barrier of entry, but instead of learning tools that you can take to other games, it's just learning how to play that game.
Yeah.
And for better or worse, like, it's very clear when somebody is good at Dungeons and Dragons. No matter what edition they're playing, if you can tell, like, when someone knows what's up when they're playing Dungeons and Dragons, right?
Yeah. I think a lot of that does transition, though, because it ends up becoming, oh, I understand how to manipulate numbers and systems well.
That's true. That's true.
I do see that translate heavily a lot.
Yeah, if you're great at just like optimizing your mechanics, you're great at optimizing your mechanics.
Mm-hmm. So, sorry about that. A little bit problem in the background. So the idea of a simulation, I mean, how would we describe a simulation type game? What would be the descriptor that we put onto it?
I think it's probably when it mechanizes physics rather than mechanizing narrative. Like, that's probably the most hard cut you can make. I mean, some games sort of definitely split between the two a little bit, but it's definitely something where it'll trend on one side or the other.
Yeah, I'd say most games do some of both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But in my mind, a game is more simulationist when they don't. It's like when they try to not deal with the game aspect of the game so much and like the player layer at all, where you have this, we're thinking of it strictly in terms of this world that we're creating, the physics of the world, the way the world operates. We're not really thinking about it as a game world that we're playing in the same way that a lot of games do a little bit of both, but you can see it coming more to the forefront in, more narrative-based games.
So, yeah, I mean, so basically we're saying something like D&D or Traveller or stuff like that, that it's very much about the rules of the universe and the mechanics therein would be more on the first side of simulationist, but more narrative focused games, Dungeon World, Apocalypse World, that sort of thing would be more on the emulationist thing, right? The idea is to create the environment in which the player will operate. The other one is very much descriptive of what you can do in that world.
So the more emulationist side, I think, exists mostly within the simulationist scale, because in my mind, the emulationist more is about how can we create a facsimile of the mechanical function versus how can we most faithfully recreate mechanical function. So like, you have a lot of simulationist systems, but they vary wildly on like how much fidelity they give to their mechanics to try and like actually recreate how their world functions or not. Like D&D, it is not very like strict on how much it cares about recreating like actual physics and functions. But there are other things like some of the GURPS modules and a lot of other games where it's like, well, they're actually really interested in like, well, what would the trajectory of this arrow actually be? Mm-hmm. And you can sort of like vary pretty significantly on that scale.
Yeah, it's that's the problem, is it's definitely much more of a sliding scale than it is like a black and white divide. I mean, there's so few games that are just one or the other, right?
That is true. I mean, like everything else, it's with many of the subjects we covered so far are very much in a sliding scale, right? It's more a focus than anything else.
Like if we were to define the extremes of the scale, it would be like Warhammer 40k tabletop gaming on one side, and all the way on the other side, it's something like Microscope.
Or like Fiasco, maybe even.
Yeah, or
Microscope has maybe even more rules, like something like Fiasco or Polaris, or even the game I played on Monday, which was The Skeletons. And again, like that, I had a blast playing that game, but I don't know that the mechanics were really informing what we did, right? Is like, they helped, but there was a lot of burden on us to just be good storytellers and to be listening to each other and making sure we were all involved and tying our characters together and creating an interesting narrative. It was
the
on
Fall
us.
of Magic. The Fall of Magic is very much that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe now that we talked about it this way, I think I'm changing my mind of what exactly one or the other could be. Although the fact that you brought Warhammer 40K is interesting because that is, the figures, it's more, again, on the wargaming side.
Yeah, I feel like that is like the quintessential example of like the fantasy wargaming that sort of turned into like what D&D was and then all of this other role-playing. Like, and Warhammer 40K is pretty much like what the origin point was in a sense. And then everything sort of came from that in a way.
And then there's like even the step back from that, which is like the classical wargaming, which is basically just reenacting a historical battle, right? It's like at that point, that might be as simulationist as you get, where it's like, okay, this really happened. We're just going to play out how this really happened.
It reminds me of...
like the people who do that in Arma.
Well, that's true. It reminds me, and by the way, Arma, for people who don't know, it's a video game that, in fact, has been used by even by some militaries to recreate some aspects of the battlefield. But it reminds me of what the first edition of D20 Star Wars, when it came out. Because clearly, if you think about Star Wars, you're trying to emulate the feel of the movies, which is completely fictional. You can't simulate space battles, especially space battles that don't look anything like what, Newtonian physics works, right?
Yeah.
But one of the problems that it had was that it had extensive ship-to-ship rules, and they were completely broken. And so they had to remake the entire game in a sort of 1.5 or 0.5 edition just to fit that and many other fixes. And one of the things they did is they made the combat more abstract, right? More about, roll some die, do some damage, more closer to the character combat, as opposed to, oh no, you move here and you do this maneuver and then you loop the loop or whatever, do an element. It was like, well, that doesn't matter. I just want to make sure whether I miss or hit with my torpedoes, right? It's, that's another game that's also Starfleet Battles, which is, again, for figures, but it was based on, again, simulating originally, it was Star Trek. But for a variety of reasons, they couldn't do it, and they couldn't get the rights to it. But the game, I try to read it. It's intense. I mean, it has rules upon rules upon rules about movement and combat and ships and space and fleets, and it's extremely detailed. But again, you're trying to simulate giant saucer ships with warp drive on them shooting, phasers in space. So
even then, any sort of space combat in Star Trek is already so abstract.
Yeah.
Where it's like you only really hear about it from like a shot of the bridge shaking.
Yeah, so I was about to say that is like, I think that's part of the reason why I tend to come down on the more emulationist side of this spectrum, because like so many of the things that we would want to simulate, we just can't. Like, we can't simulate a warp drive. We don't know what the physics of the warp drive would look like. We have no idea. So at some point, whether or not you want to make it seem realistic, it's all just made up anyway, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we don't have lasers.
Yeah, and also I think
at least
it can also slow down play a lot.
Oh, there's that.
Yeah, I mean, why don't we have many games? For example, Warhammer 40K has a hit location system. So the sort of more simulations have hit locations and other mechanics, which tend to make the things a little bit more complex. But let's say, for example, D&D, which has armor class, which is you hit or you miss. You take damage or you don't. And I think it's sort of the comfort level that Arthur was talking in the last show. What are you comfortable with? Do you really need to know where every single arrow hits in the body, or every shot, or every hit of the blade? Or do you just need to sort of keep track of the numbers to say, when you're active and when you're not, right?
Yeah,
I think Burning Wheel is a great example of this, where they've sort of baked in that sort of scale into the game itself, where you can have just like a straight up versus test where it's just like, do you get what you want or do you not? And then you can have bloody versus test where it's much more like, well, do you hit or do you miss this attack? And then you can go all the way over to like the fight scale, where it's very much like, what weapon do you use at what range, and what body part do you hit for what amount of damage for what effect?
Yeah, and so that's where I'm about to like totally contradict what I just said, because like I love the fight mechanic just because I'm totally down for like that medieval combat, like way overdoing it, spending way too much time like figuring out like how hard you're hitting with the sword and that stuff. I'm just into that. I think it's cool, and I've always enjoyed it. When you start talking about like technical ship combat and like the way the ships move through space, my eyes just glaze over. So it's like it really is just, you got to find the game that does the mechanical crunch and the simulation is stuff on the things that you're interested in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, I think it's a matter of suspension of disbelief and buy-in. Too much detail can be as difficult and stretch your suspension of disbelief as too little detail. Like, for example, one thing that really bugged me about BattleTech, and mostly it's a tabletop, tactics game, not an RPG, but it really bothered me that these giant, super sophisticated robots had very crappy missiles. Like, anybody who knows about BattleTech knows that these missiles are basically rockets with a glowing bulb in the front, and they kind of hit stuff, right? And of course, it makes sense from, you're playing with figures because of the ranges and you have to use tapes and stuff like that. But when you describe it in a fiction, it's like, well, you have like a fighter plane, just tell me where the enemy at and just use artillery and just bombard this place, right? I mean, I should be able to do that. These missiles, there's no way these multi-ton mechs that move at crawling speed can avoid a barrage of like 60 missiles or something like that. There's no way I can miss that, right? And with lasers and stuff like that. I remember reading a novel by
It's not like they're going to resist a thermonuclear blast or something.
Yeah.
I was reading a book by Michael Stackpole years ago, one of the BattleTech books, and the politics and the characters were very interesting. The moment he started talking about the mech combat, I was like, no, here we go again. I mean, this one battle, which was again this sort of fighter, and the fighter should have been shot down like in 2 shots because it's flying. I mean, but he had as much armor as a mech on the ground, and was like, and he fired his laser and he did this damage and he hit here and this missile. I'm like, Jesus Christ, just roll the die already, dude, and just kill the thing, and we can all go home, right? So it was like that. There's sometimes too much and too little can both break the immersion. Again, it depends on the buy on the players and
right. And I think another danger there is like the mechanical bloat aspect, whereas like I don't play Warhammer war games, but I've heard that it's such that like you can't know all of the rules. In my mind, that's problematic. You should not have a system such that it's impossible for one person to know all of the rules.
Even people that are like at the top level of competitive Warhammer player, like 90% of the game is knowing how to rules lawyer better than your opponent.
Right, which is, in my mind, crazy, ludicrous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
At any time somebody hands me a rule book for a game that's like over 200 pages, I'm just like, oh god. And again, that's like, I love Burning Wheel, so that just proves how much of a hypocrite I am with like a lot of these things. But
to be fair, like 400 pages of the Burning Wheel book is just like lists of traits and skills.
Right, that's a good point. But yeah, but even then is like, that is something I know as a designer I would never want to do, because the biggest problem I see with having a massive list of traits and skills is there's just no way you cover it all. It's just impossible. The more you try to do, the more stuff there's going to be, right?
That's definitely where I fell on the list of, I was just like, yeah, I can make interesting things, but I'm much better off if I just figure out what goes into making interesting traits or skills and figure out how do I actually build a tool to just make them that anyone can just use.
How do you teach people to do it on their own? That's a great point. And that's like something that I think a lot of games struggle with. It's like, that's like one of the biggest things I have a problem with, like Dungeon World, is I love bonds. I love bonds in Dungeon World.
Yeah.
I hate that there's no the info on writing your own bond after you've resolved your starting bonds is just not very good.
The same way, especially in Dungeon World, is monsters. Like, it took me forever to figure out how I was supposed to be making monsters well.
Yeah, I the way I do monsters in Dungeon World is weird. I basically just like fluff my way through it, like as I'm playing. I'll be like, okay, like this monster is like, oh, you got hit by it.
That's how you're supposed to be doing it.
Well, it would probably be like a D10 of damage.
Yeah, it's supposed to be like, well, this sort of thing seems like it would have messy hits, and it's pretty tough, so it would have like 15 hit points. And yeah, it's hard, so it would definitely be like D8 damage.
Yeah,
and that's how you're supposed to be doing it. But with these like statted out monster blocks at the book, you're just like, well, wait, what am I doing here?
That definitely confused me too when I was I mean, a game like Dungeon World is good for my style of GMing because I am the laziest GM. I do not like to prep. I like to improvise and just see where the game goes, and Dungeon World does that for me greatly. And I would often try to do similar things in 5e, but the problem with trying to do that in D&D is what ends up happening is you end up just pulling monsters directly from the monster manual, and that just gets boring for everyone involved, right?
Up to a point. I feel like something that happened sort of accidentally in D&D was I eventually got my group to the point where they liked figuring out what all the monsters were and what they did, and like that was part of it for them. Like, oh, now we know what ogres are like and all of the stats for ogres, and now we can always be ogres. And that ended up being like part of the thing for them. While with like Dungeon World, it's just like, well, is this ogre stronger than the other ogres? Maybe.
It's like, well, if your DM described it as being stronger than the other ogres, it probably is.
Yeah.
Well, but my favorite thing to do when I was running 5e would be to take something from the monster manual and then just like flavor it a little differently, just so that partly for that reason that I knew that I had some players that knew the monster manual inside and out. And also partly because I just would find it more interesting is like when I'm running a game for level 1 through 5, it's like there are a decent number of monsters, but like I don't want to throw goblins at them again. I'm just going to take the goblin stat block and call them something else and describe them as something different.
The trick with that is to do, oh god, what were those kobolds called?
Yeah,
There's the famous example of
Tucker's kobolds.
Yes, Tucker's kobolds. That was always my technique. I was just like, well, now kobolds are smart and terrifying because they're smart.
Yeah, it's all about how the DM plays for sure with that stuff. I've seen a low level 5e party tear through Deadly Encounter. If that same GM had played a little tougher, that would not have happened.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what they try to do with 3.x, basically. They try to basically allow GMs to tack on as many templates as possible. But, and I remember the nightmares of reading those monster descriptions, which are, this is half elf, half undead, half dragon, fighter, mage, blah, 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 plus special attacks, plus this. And I'm like, I just, no, I can't handle all this.
Yeah, then you have to build it, right? It's just...
Yeah.
So
I never actually ran 3.5. I only did Pathfinder, which is sort of evolved from it, but not really the same. Or 3.0 either.
Yeah, it really, I mean, again, it's one of those games that started very emulation. It's supposed to pare down the Dungeons and Dragons experience, but then exploded with a lot of stuff, right? Another game that I think it had an emulation is Trend, but I really liked it. But if you look at the character sheet, it can scare a lot of people. It's basically things based on RuneQuest. the RuneQuest system, like Stormbringer. I love the Elric and Melbyborn series, and there's a game, but half of the pages, top and numbers and whatever, and then on the bottom, it's like over 100 or more skills, right? And you have to choose them, and the way you level up is if you use a skill, you have to roll, you mark it, and then you roll against it, and if you fail, I think, or you succeed, then you can increase it by D10. But there's I think 100 or more skills there. So same people who do Call of Cthulhu, very similar system. So it's it's supposed to be this grand fantasy world, but it has all these little, skills on it. It's why do I need so much skills, right? Why do I need to have all this stuff here, which is just a little too much,
I think my biggest pet peeve with simulationist systems also is that they're making all of these rules for how to actually define things, but almost none of them actually understand what patterns things follow in real life. So all of these mechanics they're making don't actually reflect how things work in real life. They're just lots of really complicated rules. Almost everything should be using 2 or 3 dice and having a binomial distribution of pretty much any sort of task that people are doing. But most of them use a single dice plus modifiers, which doesn't really reflect almost anything.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the point that you were making, Raphael, about when you're playing war games, is the mech, why can't the mech just do blank? And I think the skills list thing goes back to what you mentioned before, that Arthur had mentioned last week, which is some people, a lot of people, they want to be able to look at their sheet and see, look, it says sword and then has a number, and that means I'm that number good at sword. That says farming and it has a number, so I know that if I need to go farming, I get to roll that many dice. And it's if you have, it's that, it's a safety net. It keeps you from having to worry as a player, which, I'm not particularly concerned about, but I do see why people like that. They like to be able to look down at their sheet, look at their skills, and say, I can do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I think the question is, how abstract is the abstract? Because all role-playing games are abstractions, right? And I think I talked about this last week about Japanese games. They're an abstraction of an abstraction of an abstraction. You take your, mostly from computer games. So computer games are an abstraction of an RPG, which is an abstraction of either fantasy setting or even realized setting. And then it went to Japan, and that got abstracted because they didn't get some of the, they put hit points, a gazillion hit points in a Final Fantasy game because, hit points are part of RPGs. But it's a ridiculous amount of hit points that don't really make any sense. And every time you kill something, you level up 5 levels. Because, that's what you do in RPGs. You level up. But it's the action without the context. It keeps attracting to the point where it becomes meaningless. And I think that's the ticker in the slider. How abstract and where do you extract that kind of matters.
Yeah. Again, to go back to Burning Wheel, it's at this weird sort of point where it's in some ways it seems simulationist, where you have all these traits and skills, but the way all the traits and skills interact with each other are almost exclusively narratively. So it's well, what really is it?
Yeah, the way I would describe it would be, I would call it a mechanics first game that masquerades as a narrative first game. Because there's it deals heavily with the narrative, but most of the ways it deals with the narrative is still through mechanics, right? It's you have beliefs. Beliefs are a mechanic that you're rewarded for to act a certain way in the narrative. And also just I find it kind of hard to look at a book that's 400 pages long and has lists of skills and traits and say that it's not a mechanics first game. It seems kind of a hard argument to make.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely mechanical, but I'm not sure it's simulationist at all.
Oh, that I might agree with.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's
just because of the one exception I would say is like the complex fight mechanics, which are definitely simulationist. But otherwise, like the task intent sort of relationship is very much narrative. Like, yeah, you have these skills of values in them, but they're almost always resolved exclusively narratively in a way you'd expect much more from something like Apocalypse World.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, it is that it's definitely somewhere in between, because there are, like something, like fight is about as simulationist as any fighting mechanic you can find in many games. Like, definitely more so than like Pathfinder or these games that we think of as mechanically heavy, mechanically driven. But you don't need to use fight. You could play Burning Wheel for forever and never use fight.
Yep.
That gives you the option, so at least you can abstract, again, as much as you need to within the confines of the game.
Which is something a lot of systems don't do, but absolutely needed to.
Yeah, but that then brings us back to the complexity issue of the last show, which is the more options you have, the more chances that the system becomes obtuse and obscure to the point where it's like, well, what do I use, right? Where do I go? Because that's another thing. It's about guidance as well. The feel of the game will tell you, okay, these are the must-need rules, and these are the ones that we suggest that you have, and these are the ones, well, somebody thought, put in the back corner of the book somewhere because we thought it was cool, right? And you go from there, right? So I think it's also about focus as well.
A system that I think actually does that decently well for all of its faults is 5e D&D.
Yeah.
It does a lot of like, we're going to cut out some rules. Here are some optional options. Here's like something you can do if you want. And I still think they should do it more. Like, there are definitely times where it's just like, you're trying to make your game more narratively focused. Just do it. Like, a perfect example is, there's all these rules for attacking incapacitated opponents. You can throw out all of that block of text and just say, if somebody is knocked out on the ground and you can stab them in the throat, they die.
Yeah.
That's all you need.
Like, there's something 5e is definitely moving towards that I think is ultimately going to be the direction D&D goes, where it has a very narrative-focused rules, but it's all broken down into modules. So it'll be like, here's the module for here's the different modules you can use for downtime actions. And there are like differing degrees of just like complexity and detail. And I think that's absolutely the direction that D&D is going, which is interesting. And I'm like, it's this weird thing where D&D is getting like so broad that it's sort of meaningless to say you're playing D&D anymore. Because D&D groups are just so different in what that means.
Yeah, I think there was a poll. I can't remember where I saw this. I think I must have seen it on the Wizards website. But something like 60% of Dungeon Masters they polled say that they do not play in a published setting. They play a homebrew setting. That's a huge number. I mean, for the amount of resources that company puts into releasing modules and worlds and all that sort of thing, like a ton of people are, I mean, I'm sure they're using parts of it. Like, most of those DMs still use the monster manual, and they still use some, maybe the gods or whatever, but it's a huge number of people that are just making their own stuff.
So like a great example, I think, that is probably the most close similar situation is World of Warcraft. Like, a majority of the player base doesn't participate in any single aspect of World of Warcraft. Like, only a minority only a minority do raiding, only a minority of a minority do like advanced raiding. And so like, there's no aspect of a game that the majority of the players actually do beyond leveling up. But like, put that all together and you get your like massive player base of a game. So I think that's like where D&D is going, where it's just like there's like a billion different sub communities in the game, but it's still in the end all one game.
Yeah, but I think it's going back to the start in many ways. I mean, some stuff works like Greyhawk and stuff like that were created by the people who created the game as their campaign worlds. Then they became the official worlds, and also because over the time they pushed different worlds, Greyhawk, Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms, etc. There was a time when most people just played campaigns that were already there because it's much easier to pick up a box set and start playing. But there's been so much of it over the years, and you have players who are especially GM players who are very experienced. It's like at some point we don't want to keep retreading everything that everyone else has done, right? And in 4th edition, even 5th edition, we're sort of looking to go back to that generic. We're not going to give you a fixed setting. We're going to give you ideas of how to do it, give you the flavor of D&D, but not give you D&D must be X, Y, or Z, right? And even then, they kind of still push it because there are a lot of the suggestions in the book are like, well, we're doing this in Forgotten Realms, and now we're doing this on Ravenloft, and so they're like as well.
The way they're doing those books, though, are really interesting in that they're all like describing different styles of campaigns people run. Mm-hmm. Like the Curse of Strahd is like very much like, here's how a sandbox game works, and here's all the things that go into making a sandbox game and how you run sandbox games, while you have very much more like whatever the Dragon Prince's one was.
Yeah, it's like,
which is very much like, here's an epic fantasy campaign that stretches like from town to town to town, sort of thing.
And then you have like, I think one of the their starter adventure for 5e I think is actually really great, which is the Lost Mines of whatever. I think it's pretty good as far as like railroading goes. Like it's decent, and it's great for teaching you how to make a D&D campaign. Mm-hmm. That's what it's really good at. It's like, here are some things you should think about when you make a dungeon. You should have some different ways for your characters to go. You should have maybe some options for them to parlay. It's interesting how they're it's got to be purposeful. I mean, it's definitely
how
not
you make a dungeon crawl,
right?
Because that's where modules were at. Modules were really a way of teaching GMs and players to play by playing. Here's a dungeon, here's when this monster shows up, this is a trap, this is a secret door. And as you play them, you're like, so, if I make my own, then I should have these monsters, stuff like that, etc. But
they were much less explicit in the past, I think, is the big difference.
Yeah.
Like, this is very much, it's very direct in like, I'm literally sitting you down and teaching you, this is what a sandbox game is, this is what sandbox games need. Well, before it was just like, here's a sandbox game.
And bringing it back to the simulations versus emulation thing and the complexity and all that, and how much you abstract versus how much you put in. I did play about 6 months ago a Pathfinder scenario where we started playing it, which was Kingmaker. We were doing 5th edition rule set. The ideas were pretty cool. The adventures were well written. They were very interesting. But when you went to the layer of the strategic layer, the building of kingdoms and stuff like that, it was too little one and too little of the other, right? It tried to be simple enough so you can sort of say, okay, I'm going to throw some money or make some rolls and I get, these results. But it didn't have enough depth so you could really tweak it and show that the player's decisions really had an effect on what was going behind the scenes. And it also could be easily overridden by the fiction anyway. So if you spend 5 hours with your GM throwing dice, whatever, and then next session a band of goblins shows up and destroys a sawmill, you're like, okay, I spent all those resources and it's gone. It's
it's actually too bad because I think Arthur is actually running a 5e Kingmaker game, if I'm not mistaken, on Twitch. But what I think, as far as that goes, that's like something that Stars Without Number, the faction turn can get a little bit weird. It would be nice if the Stars Without Number faction turn was more explicit about how to convert that way of thinking into the player layer of thinking. Mm-hmm. Which it doesn't really do. They're like pretty much completely separated. So it's like, it's hard to know. It's like, all right, my players blew up like half of this faction shit. So like, how many faction creds should they lose? Like, I don't even know. You know, it's like, well, this base is gone, so I guess I can take that away. But, like, would this base be gone? Would this army be gone? Like, would it just be hurt? Like, it's really up to the GM to just kind of do it.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing. It's like, again, the tactical player side of the section, and it happens. I haven't seen any role-playing game that does it very well. It's one of my pet peeves. How to integrate what I call, I said this before in the program, the vertical integration. That is, players leveling up and getting abilities and ranks, whatever, with the horizontal, how they affect the world they're in. And Sandbox very much is supposed to be like that, but it depends. If you put like a Kingmaker, you start putting up, creating buildings and stuff like that and having them as rulers, then it changes the scope a little bit. One is very strategic, sort of top down, you're moving pieces around, and the other one is just the players, going to dungeons and killing monsters, which is very, very small scale stuff. Unless they encounter the big dragon or something and they kill it, and then you have to sort of transfer that back to the strategic layer, right?
Yeah.
I think the only solution I could come up with is essentially having a game where you have 2 characters per player. One that deals with the strategic aspect, sort of a leader character, and then having a henchman that goes and does the thing, right? Goes in a spaceship and attacks a pirate base, or goes into the dungeon to retrieve a magical item or whatever, and then have the 2 sort of correlate with each other. How exactly that would be done, I'm still thinking about it, but,
So the way I solved that in my game was that I basically turned factions into characters. I basically said that, like, okay, so characters have beliefs, they have goals, and they have skills, and you can do the same thing with a faction, but the abstraction you make is like, okay, so you have 6 skill swordsmanship. And if you're a faction, that means you have like resources 6 worth of swordsmen, and those swordsmen are up to 6 skill. And additional, so like if you have faction versus faction stuff, then like if they lose their like swordsmanship resource, you just reduce that skill level down. But if it's on like player versus faction, then you can know like, oh, they have so many swordsmen of XYZ skill. And if you destroy some of those, then you know how to correspondingly reduce then the faction result.
Yeah, that's kind of sort of like what Blades in the Dark does with the faction as well, where you just turn the gang into a character. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting idea.
And then like the gang itself actually like influences things on both the character level and its own level, and
then you also can add the whole like faction management aspect, whereas like the classic, the line from the Apocalypse World, the cultist playbook or whatever, where it's like, if you're going to have a cult, you have to manage your fucking cult. Excuse the language, but that's the way Apocalypse World talks. But it's like, I love that. It's like, yeah, if you're going to have a faction, you can't just leave your faction and go adventuring and expect them to just prosper. You got to manage the faction.
Yeah. Which again, it's one of the things that happening in my in that campaign, which was Pathfinder 5e Hybrid, was that my character was supposed to be the ruler, but he was a character. So if he went to adventure and got hurt or killed, well, you lost your ruler. And it's like, oops, what do we do now? We get someone other character to roll up and decide to be the ruler? I mean, that kind of thing. I mean, it can happen, and probably does happen quite a bit. So there's that. And you can't, if you're going to get engaged in that, you have to play and accept that that's going to happen. Right?
I mean, it sounds like, Raphael, you're realizing why kings don't go on adventures.
Yeah. Yep.
This is why the president can't just, go off and hike in the woods. If he dies, what happens?
Or grab a submachine gun and take on the terrorists.
Exactly. You just can't do it.
As awesome as how
you can't all be Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was thinking, but he's kind of the exception that proves the rule a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, in his case, it was more a situation of he's not really going to do that, is he? Is he?
So yeah, that's so yeah. I think we exhausted this. We basically went around the circles trying to figure it out. For next week, I think we can tackle something similar to this, which is the clash between the meta and the mechanics, especially in games like Shadowrun and White Wolf, because I really want to get into that. And I think we're probably going to talk more about the meta and our takes on this sort of greater fiction and how they reflect or are reflected by the rules. So I'd like to thank both Ascardium and Sam for being here. Can you tell us where they can find you on the net, aside from this lovely program of ours?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Scaridium, Searidium. I mostly just use Twitter, though, where I rant about science things primarily, but also game design.
And I am Wisefool or Wizened Fool on Twitch, Wisefool on Discord. I am hopefully going to be starting streaming soon with this new rig I've got, so keep a lookout for that. Other than that, just if you see me in a chat, say what up. I'm always, talking to people about game design and whatnot in chats, and particularly on the Mathsquad server. So if you see me, say hi.
And you can find me at Lessons Learned on YouTube. Trying and keep on trying to put that on Twitch as well. We'll see how that works in the future. And a shout out to our patron saint of the Mathsquad community, which is Adam Koebel. You can find him as Skinny Ghost on Reddit and on Twitter, and as Adam Koebel on YouTube and Twitch. So thank you for watching. Hopefully this recording will not be as bad as I hope it won't be. And we will see you when we see you. Take care.
Bye.